Well, hi everyone. Welcome to the Hard Answers. I'm Tom Graham. Today we're going to go through some facts about the religion of Islam. Most Muslims live in the Middle East and North Africa. In fact, 91.2% of all Muslims live in the Middle East and North Africa. Another 6% live in Europe and 1% live in North America. How do Muslims feel about ISIS and Islamist extremists? Well, it depends. Muslims in Lebanon and Jordan do not like ISIS at all. Most Muslims do not give an opinion on ISIS. In fact, 62% of Pakistanis will not give an opinion about ISIS. 20% of Nigerian Muslims feel or see ISIS favorably. The Nigerian militant group Boko Haram, which has been conducting a terrorist campaign in the country for years, has sworn allegiance to ISIS. More generally, Muslims mostly say that suicide bombings and other forms of violence against civilians in the name of Islam are rarely or never justified, including 92% of Indonesia and 91% in Iraq. In the United States, a 2011 survey found that 86% of Muslims say that such tactics are rarely or never justified. An additional 7% say suicide bombings are sometimes justified, and 1% say they are often justified. It's estimated that there are 3.3 million Muslims in the United States alone. 1% of 3.3 million is about 30,000 Muslims in the U.S. who may believe suicide bombings are often justified. A 2015 Pew poll indicates that 42% of Muslim youths in Paris always support suicide bombings. In a few countries, a quarter or more of Muslims say that these acts of violence are at least sometimes justified, including 40% in the Palestinian territories, 39% in Afghanistan, 29% in Egypt, and 26% in Bangladesh. In many cases, people in countries with large Muslim populations are as concerned as Western nations about the threat of Islamist extremism and have become increasingly concerned in recent years. About 2/3 of people in Nigeria and Lebanon say in 2015 they are very concerned about Islamist extremism in their country, both up significantly since 2013. A Pew 2011 survey of Muslim Americans found that roughly half of U.S. Muslims, 48%, say their own religious leaders have not done enough to speak out against Islamic or Islamist extremists. Sharia law. Nearly all Muslims in Afghanistan, 99%, and most in Iraq, 91%, and Pakistan, 84%, support Sharia law as official law. But in some other countries, especially in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, including Turkey, Kazakhstan, and Azerbaijan, relatively few favor the implementation of Sharia law at the governmental level. Indonesia. Aceh, with a population of about 5 million people, is the only part of Indonesia to apply Sharia law in full. Islamic courts in Aceh had long handled cases of marriage, divorce, and inheritance. After special autonomy legislation was passed in 2001, the reach of courts extended to criminal justice. Offenses such as being alone with an unrelated member of the opposite gender, gambling, and breaking Islamic dress rules can be punished with a public caning. In 2014, the provincial government of Aceh extended Sharia's reach, enacting and enforcing Sharia to apply it to non-Muslims as well. In other parts of Indonesia, religious courts have jurisdiction over civil cases between Muslim spouses on matters concerning marriage, divorce, reconciliation, and alimony. Parties can apply to district courts for adjudication on basis of Roman Dutch law or local Sharia courts. Muslim litigants could originally choose whether to have inheritance questions decided by the Islamic courts or by the civil courts, but a 2006 amendment eliminated this possibility. The same amendment gave Islamic courts new jurisdiction over property disputes, including financial and economic matters. Muslims seeking a divorce must also file their claim in Islamic courts. Indonesia has elected 2 female heads of state. If Indonesia completely implements Sharia law, more than likely, women will no longer be allowed to participate at that level of politics. Pakistan. Until 1978, Islamic law was largely restricted to personal status issues. With the introduction of Sharia courts, far-reaching changes were made in the criminal justice system. Now, a Sharia court has the power to judge any law or government actions to be against Islam, and to review court cases for adherence to Islamic law. The Penal Code includes elements of Sharia. Under Article 5, Section 2 of the Ordinance Number 7 of 1979, whoever is guilty of zina, if he or she is a mushan, is be stoned to death at a public place, or if he or she is not a mushan, be punished at a public place by whipping numbering 100 stripes. Under a 2006 law, rape cases can be heard under civil as well as Islamic law. India. India's Muslims follow India's law, but also follow their own laws governing family life and other personal issues such as marriage and divorce, with Sharia courts used to rule on such matters and mediate in disagreements. However, India's Supreme Court ruled in July of 2014 that Islamic judges who interpret religious law could only rule when individuals submitted voluntarily to them, and their decisions, or fatwas, were not legally binding. So I personally agree with India's take on Sharia law. If you want it to apply to you and you voluntarily go along with it, that's fine. But if you completely disagree with it, the government should not force you to follow a religious edict. Bangladesh. Marriage, divorces, and alimony and property inheritance are regulated by Sharia for Muslims. This has extended to India, Bangladesh, and the Philippines. Nigeria. A mixed legal system of English common law and traditional law. Iran. All judicial rulings must be based upon authoritative Islamic sources and authentic fatwa. Book 2 of the Islamic Penal Code of Iran is entirely devoted to hudud punishments. Iranian application of Sharia has been seen by scholars as highly flexible and directly contradicting traditional interpretations of the Sharia. So basically, a Sharia kangaroo court. Turkey. As part of Ataturk reforms, Sharia was abolished in 1924, and the law regarding the abolition of Islamic law courts and amendments regarding the court organization. Egypt. Article 2 of Egypt's 2014 Constitution declares the principles of Islamic Sharia to be the main source of legislation. The bottom line is this: most Muslim majority countries incorporate Sharia at some level in their legal framework, with many calling it the highest law or the source of the law of the land in their constitution. In fact, many of these countries' full names are the Islamic Republic of Iran, Iraq, whatever. Most use Sharia for personal law, marriage, divorce, domestic violence, child support, family law, inheritance, and such matters. Elements of Sharia are present to varying extents in their criminal justice system. Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Brunei, Qatar, Pakistan, the United Arab Emirates, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, and Sudan apply the code predominantly or entirely, while it only applies in some parts of Indonesia. Most Muslim majority countries with Sharia prescribed hudud punishments in their legal code do not prescribe it routinely and use other punishments instead. The harshest Sharia penalties, such as stoning, beheading, and the death penalty, are enforced with varying levels of consistency. Since the 1970s, most Muslim-majority countries have faced demand from their growing religious groups and political parties for immediate adoption of Sharia as the sole, or at least the primary, legal framework. Some moderates and liberal scholars within the Muslim countries have argued for limited expansion of Sharia. So what is Sharia law? Cases involving violations of some religious duties, lawsuits over property and business disputes, and family law all came before the Qadis. Most of these cases, except the religious duty cases, would be considered civil law matters in Western courts today. Family law. Family law always made up an important part of the Sharia. Here are some features of family law in the classic Sharia that would guide the Qadi in making his decisions. Usually an individual became an adult at puberty. A man could marry up to 4 wives at once. A wife could refuse to accompany her husband on journeys. The support of an abandoned infant was a public responsibility. A wife had the right to food, clothing, housing, and a marriage gift from her husband. When the owner of a female slave acknowledged her child as his own, the child became free. The child's mother became free when the owner died. In an inheritance, a brother took twice the amount as the sister. However, the brother also had financial responsibility for his sister until she marries. A husband could dissolve a marriage by repudiating his wife 3 times. A wife could return her dowry to her husband for a divorce. She could also get a decree from a Qadi ending the marriage if her husband mistreated, deserted, or failed to support her. After a divorce, the mother usually had the right of custody of her young children. Criminal law. The classic Sharia identified the most serious crimes as those mentioned in the Quran. These were considered sins against Allah and carried mandatory punishments. Some of these crimes and punishments were adultery, punished by death by stoning; highway robbery by execution, crucifixion, exile, imprisonment, or your right hand and left foot cut off; thievery, your right hand cut off. For the second offense, your left foot was cut off, and further offenses, you were imprisoned. Slander, 80 lashes. Drinking wine or any other intoxicant, 80 lashes. Officials in the Caliph carried out the penalties for these crimes. Crimes against a person included murder and bodily injury. In these cases, the victim or his male next of kin had the right of retaliation where possible. This meant, for example, that the male next of kin of a murder victim could execute the murderer after his trial, usually by cutting his head off with a sword. If someone lost the sight of an eye in an attack, he could retaliate by putting a red-hot needle into the eye of the attacker who had been found guilty by the law. But a rule of exactitude requiring that the retaliator must give the same amount of damage he received if even by accident he injured the person too much, he had broken the law and was subject to punishment. The rule of exactitude discouraged retaliation. Usually the injured person or his kinsman would agree to accept money or something of value instead of retaliating. This seems to mimic the Jewish and Christian eye for an eye stance. However, the Muslim intent is retaliation, but the Jewish and Christian intent is to let the punishment feed the crime. In a third category of less serious offenses such as gambling and bribery, the judge uses his discretion in deciding on a penalty. Punishments would often require the criminal to pay a reparation to the victim, receive a certain number of lashes, or just be locked up for a while. Comparing Sharia punishment to Western punishment. Sharia punishments seem to be out of touch with modernity. However, just 150 years ago, in 1865, America, slave owners whipped slave for disobedience. In 1779, Thomas Jefferson wrote a law in Virginia which contained a punishment of castration for men who engage in sodomy. Sodomy law stayed on the books until 2003. The West has come a long way in the last 60 years, and punishment for people who break the law are far less cruel and unusual as they used to be. But we still use waterboarding during military interrogations at the Guantanamo Bay military base. The West cannot and should not pretend we are above such things. Sharia priorities, however, don't coincide with Western priorities. Theft of property is literally punishable by horrific forms of torturous death, including crucifixion under Sharia, while theft in the U.S. is punishable by imprisonment and restitution. Under Sharia, adultery is a crime against the state, while in the U.S. it's a family court matter. Sharia believes in polygamy, and the West is monogamous. The West also puts a large value on the separation of church and state, and Muslims, for the most part, want Sharia implemented as the law of the land. And that makes Westerners nervous. The U.S. Constitution has gone as far as stating that each citizen has the right to select the religion of their choice, and no religion shall be preferred over any other by the government. What do Muslims think of the West? And what does the West think of Muslims? Attitudes towards Jews are uniformly negative across the Muslim world. Nearly every Muslim population surveyed say Westerners are selfish, violent, greedy, immoral, arrogant, and fanatical. About half of U.S. citizens, Russians, and Western Europeans think Muslims are fanatical and violent, but they also think Muslims are honest. To the extent that people in Western countries say some religions are more prone to violence than others, large majorities say Islam is the most violent religion. Among Muslims who say some religions are more violent, Judaism is typically named the worst offender. Christians in the 4 Western European countries surveyed, and in Russia, overwhelmingly identify first as citizens of their countries rather than as Christians. Only in the U.S. do as many Christians identify primarily with their religion as those that identify primarily with their nationality. In contrast, Muslims in most of the large Muslim countries surveyed identify themselves primarily with their religion. In 2016, a 2016 Pew Research Center survey conducted in 10 nations found that negative views about Muslims prevailed in Eastern and Southern Europe. However, the majority of respondents in the UK, Germany, France, Sweden, and the Netherlands gave Muslims a favorable rating. Views about Muslims are tied to ideology. While 47% of Germans on the political right give Muslims an unfavorable rating, just 17% on the left do so. The gap between left and right is also roughly 30 percentage points in Italy and Greece. Islamist extremism. Worries about extremism are higher across the Western countries surveyed than they are in the Muslim countries surveyed. Overall, a median of 52% across 9 Western nations are very concerned about Islamist extremism. Across the 10 countries with Muslim populations of around half or more, including Middle Eastern, Asian, and African nations, the median who are very concerned is 42%. Nevertheless, roughly half or more of people across the countries surveyed say that they are at least somewhat concerned about Islamist extremism in their country. As a whole, the Middle East and North African region continue to have the highest levels of religious hostilities in the world. In 2014, the median level of religious hostilities in the Middle East and North Africa reached a level 4 times that of the global median. The types of social hostilities included in this measure varied from religion-related arms conflict to sectarian violence and other religion-related intimidation or abuse. Summary. Western attitudes towards Muslims in general are both positive and negative. About half believe Muslims are honest but violent fanatics. Muslim attitudes towards Westerners are generally negative. In general, they say that Westerners are selfish, violent, greedy, immoral, arrogant, and fanatical. Most Muslims will not give an opinion about ISIS, though. But the ones that will are either extremely for or extremely against ISIS. Most Muslims are concerned about Islamist extremism. Most Muslims are against suicide bombings. Muslims' values are very much like Western values, although Sharia priorities don't coincide with Western priorities. Sharia legal punishments today are far more brutal than Western legal punishments today. Muslims will be the largest religion on the planet by 2070. Most Muslim majority countries incorporate Sharia at some level in their legal framework, with many of their constitutions calling it the highest law or the source of the law of the land. Most Muslim countries use Sharia for personal law, including marriage, divorce, domestic violence, child support, family law, and inheritance matters. One of the most basic principles in American society is the separation of church and state. The right to believe and practice whatever religion you choose, and the state shall give no preference to one religion over another. Muslim majority countries incorporate Sharia law into their justice system, their laws, and their constitution. Some Muslim legal scholars and imams have decided homosexuality is a sin, a crime, and is punishable by death. In Saudi Arabia, Sudan, Afghanistan, and Iran, homosexuality is punishable by death. Most other Muslim majority countries make homosexual behavior illegal, but in practice, governmental anti-homosexual sentiment comes in waves, and for the most part, governments prefer to ignore homosexuals, or else they'll have to recognize that homosexuality isn't just a Western thing. However, countries that have both a large Christian and a large Muslim population still have the same sodomy laws, making it questionable as to whether it's an Islamic thing or a Middle Eastern culture thing. The U.S. respects all people's rights and sometimes goes a little bit overboard in enforcing anti-discrimination laws. The U.S. has a history of correcting a systemic injustice towards minorities. We even had a civil war against ourselves, killing 620,000 of our own people to end the injustice of slavery. And since then, we have applied that ideology to other minority rights issues. During the Civil Rights Movement, we had to use federal government force against our own local governments to ensure black people were not being discriminated against. We live in a society that is tolerant of almost everything, and as a society, we should not be tolerant of systemic intolerance. But we have to remember that each one of us deserves the right to follow any religion we want in order to achieve our own conception of a good life. Religions across the United States have councils of elders and other religious authorities that parishioners voluntarily submit to in matters of marriage, child rearing, and other family matters, and there is no discernible difference between members of Islam voluntarily submitting to their religious Sharia courts' findings. As far as the brutal punishments, not including killing or maiming, people voluntarily participate in BDSM for pleasure. So however a country treats BDSM, they should treat brutal religious punishments the same way as long as the recipient of the punishment is submitting voluntarily. If the men and women who follow Islam are voluntarily participating and they are not discriminating against anyone who isn't voluntarily participating, then the government of the United States has no right to interfere. The federal government does not get to tell church or devoutly religious store owners that they have to provide contraception to their employees, and they don't get to tell Muslims they can't submit to Sharia courts. However, Sharia courts should never, ever be part of any legal, local, or state government in the U.S. And finally, my opinion is that until the extremist followers of Islam, the Islamists, or for that matter, extremists of any religion, until they are strong enough and confident enough, are civilized enough to accept criticism of their holy books and of their holy figureheads, they will continue to be uncivilized religious sects. You can't kill everyone who disagrees with you. You can't kill everyone who burns your holy book or makes art picturing your holy figureheads out of elephant dung or creates cartoons mocking your holy figureheads. Christians have had to put up with this nonsense for centuries. It is not civilized to kill those who disagree with or mock you. You must accept the public criticism gracefully. You are under no obligation to agree with what they say, and you are free to protest and to engage in civil discourse and rhetoric to convince people otherwise. But you cannot persuade them. But if you cannot persuade them with words, then you must accept that fact, you must tolerate that fact, and you must move on. If you use violence to protect the honor of your religion, then your actions are saying that you don't respect the laws of society, and therefore society should no longer tolerate you or your religious sect. Society should deem you as uncivilized barbarians and ought to treat you as such. To the mass majority of Muslims in the world that are indeed civilized, I say to you, Assalamu alaikum, and thank you for watching. Please click the subscribe button to see more videos like this. If you disagree with me, please leave a comment. My ears are always open, and I learn new things every day when people disagree with me. I'm Tom Graham. I'll see you next time on The Hard Answers.